Hello, dear friends, and welcome to another episode of Life of Love, where we gather every week with special soul searchers and people of light and love. And today is no exception. We have a wonderful spirit here, Irene Stern-Frielich, and she's coming here from the East Coast, and she's had a lot of travels the last few years, and I'm so excited for her to share her journeys and her discoveries. She is a detective in the biggest sense. And she's written a book which has gotten an award. It's called Shattered Stars, Healing Hearts, Unraveling My Father's Holocaust Story. So check that out. She goes into her story, her family story that she's uncovered little by little, piece by piece. And it's just, I've read it, and it's an incredible documentary, and it's really an inspiration. So, Irene, thank you for being on Life of Love. I'm so happy to have you.
Thank you, Julie. I'm thrilled to be here.
We have so much to cover and so little time. And I just, gosh, you grew up in the States, and it sounded like from your book you had sort of a childhood where you're getting your stuff done, being productive and an active child. And it seems like maybe you knew your dad was sort of tortured by something, but you never really knew what. And would you like to just give some insight as to your childhood and if you thought like he dropped some seeds of things that he tried to protect you from, or do you feel like you're so insulated that this was more of an adult thing?
Yeah, so I mean, that's really a heavy question, and that's a lot of what I do explore and come to realize in the book. But, growing up, I knew that my father had been in Germany and in Holland during the Holocaust. And I knew a couple of tidbits of his story. I knew he was in hiding, but that's all I knew. He didn't talk about it, which is very common for Holocaust survivors. They either talk about it, sometimes too much for their kids, sometimes not at all. So he had this trauma, and I now have the word for inherited trauma that I did not know until about 5 years ago. And so there was just these unspoken secrets, I would say, that permeated my childhood, right? You just didn't talk about it, you didn't ask about it. And I felt very different because of that. Like my father had an accent. I didn't know the whole story, couldn't talk about it with my friends because I didn't know, couldn't talk about it in my extended family because they didn't talk about it. And so I just, like you said, just head down, do my thing, overachieve, because that is what the message I took from it. And
because your dad is just such a hard worker. I
he
mean,
was really hard worker. And, he had an 8th grade education. He was never able to finish school or go back to school. And he just worked physically. He worked a very difficult job making a life for our family. So that's what I learned from him.
Yeah. Did you get the feeling he shared with your mom at all? I mean, I didn't get that in your book of like your mom's perspective, if she is able to help him integrate anything, or if it was just like that was just he put it in a box and that was just it. He had his box of memories, and how did your mom show up in this?
Yeah. So, one of the things that's so hard about this story and many people's stories is that they never asked their parents things. And then one day they die, and then there's this regret that we never asked our parents things. Now, my father died when I was 33, so I was pretty young, which is why I never got to really ask him questions. But my mother died when I was 23. So I truly was never in a place in my life where I realized I should be asking her these questions. So I have actually no idea what she knows. I assume my father told her everything, but she never talked about it. And I was very young when she died, so I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I understood earlier the power of the divine feminine, and how women can support each other in a way that is just beautiful. And when we feel things, and not that men don't feel things, but we tend to anticipate or help out in a way it's nurturing, because that's sort of what we're wired to do. And that to me, my insight is that they gave you such a good life that they just didn't want you to have to look back
Mm-hmm.
and face the horror of what he went through on his 12th birthday. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, do you want to go there? His family was living in Germany, a very successful shop with clothing, and your grandmother was a seamstress. It's just a beautiful life. It just sounds like a storybook. This little town in Germany with a storefront. They worked so hard to build a life, and then on his 12th birthday, you talk about how there is broken glass, and that's how your book was named. I'm assuming that
Mm-hmm.
Shattered Glass was how it all started.
Yeah. Well, it was building up. The shattered glass happened in 1938. And when Hitler
Mhm.
came into power in 1933, things already started getting bad for Jewish people. But 1938 was the culmination of that. And actually, you're right. The title "Shattered" refers to the shattering of their lives, really,
Mhm.
the glass and their whole lives. And star in German is Stern. So it's the shattering of my family,
The
the
Stern
Sterns.
family. Oh
Yes.
my goodness.
Yeah.
Chills. Oh, chills all the way up.
So that's how I came to that part of the title. Yeah.
Whew.
And
Oh.
I should say how I found out about that experience of my father's, because he never told me really what happened on that night. That is referred to as Kristallnacht, the night of shattered glass in German.
Yeah, yeah.
He had made what's called a testimony video, where a lot of Holocaust survivors made these videos, and the most famous ones are at the Shoah Foundation, at USC, and at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C. So he made his own. With somebody videoed him. I don't know who it was. It
Yeah.
never went anywhere other than to my brother and me after he died. So we received the video after he died in 19. When did he die? In 1994, a long time ago.
Mm.
And I took it out again in 2017 to really start delving into the story. And because we have the internet now, it wasn't so great back when he died, if we had it at all. I can't even remember.
Mhm.
I was able to research all these things that he found, and I should say, all of the places where he was and the experience he had. And so that's how I found out about his experience on Kristallnacht and what happened. And so
So I'm just imagining opening up this package that came through the will or
yeah,
whatever, however he had it stored,
yeah,
and did you watch it in the 90s, or you just
yeah.
waited?
Oh, I watched it. It was on the old tape,
VHS,
VCR,
VCR.
VHS tape. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So that's what we had back then. Some people listening might not even know what that is, but that's okay.
at least it wasn't a beta.
Right, that's true.
We had a
But I
beta.
did watch it, and I
Yeah.
couldn't understand the chronology. It seemed disjointed and jumpy.
Hmm.
And I couldn't understand the words he was saying, the places in Holland, because the pronunciation is not what I was used to. And even when he spelled it out, like he was in these little tiny towns, I wouldn't have been able to find that on a map. So I did listen to it once, and I put it away, and I literally said, maybe one day I'll come back to this. So in 2017 is when I came back to it.
And you had the world at your fingertips. And I'm just picturing you going to Google and typing in Google Maps and getting the aerials of these places, and just, like, you were super sleuth. I mean, the way you untangled this hairball of whatever he said, like, like,
Mhm.
you really, it was your mission. And it's just so beautiful how you took that. And were you able to restore it? Has that been part of his legacy that you've preserved? And
Yeah, yeah. So even in order to watch it again in 2017, I couldn't watch it on the VHS tape. So I brought it somewhere where they digitized it for me. So
okay,
now I do have it available on YouTube to the people. It's actually in the book notes,
nice.
which are online. But yeah, so it's available, and my cousins have been watching it, and some friends who are really into the story have watched it as well. Because, it's really amazing to hear his voice tell the story.
Hmm.
It's one
Oh,
thing when I write, even when I'm writing his exact words, that it's a totally different experience to hear him say it out loud.
yeah, and the whole foresight of your grandfather. to do what he did. He saw the signs. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's such a good thing for everyone to learn. Like, notice when things in your environment are pivoting. Don't live with your blinders on. And it was clear to me, and maybe you want to tell the listeners about what he did to preserve and plan for your family to exit, because he knew it was coming. I mean, he had
Mm-hmm.
that fake
Mm-hmm.
wall or whatever, that climbing through the window thing. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, maybe you want to take us through that. And yeah, I'm just so excited to hear it from you, because reading it's just such an adventure. It's
It's
just,
really amazing. I remember when I was younger, understanding enough to know that my family didn't leave Germany to come to America before it was too late, basically, and being upset about that and angry about that. And what I've since learned was that not many people could come to America. There were quota systems in place. So clearly, my grandfather was trying to get out of the country. I do know that now. But because he had this foresight, he, number one, smuggled his own money across the border into Holland,
into
which
a
is what
Dutch
they call the
account,
Netherlands,
like a
into a
safe
Dutch
account.
bank account, right,
Oh
which
my
came in
God.
very handy. They needed that money when they got.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, at some point early in the 1920s or 30s, I guess, he went in the attic, he built some kind of a hidden window. I don't know exactly if there was a wall in front of it, but it was not obvious to anybody except he knew where it was. And it was on Kristallnacht that they utilized that hidden window, believe it or not, and escaped through that window onto their roof, because the brown shirts, so the Nazis that were damaging, like um, totally destroying their business,
Mm-hmm.
could have come upstairs into their living quarters as well. And so that's why they went out on the roof through this hidden window.
In their pajamas.
In their pajamas. That's all they
Yeah.
had was their pajamas. And in fact, it was cold out. So it was November at night. So it was cold. And so my father explains in his video, my grandfather went back down into the store, so all the way downstairs, to get their coats, which I guess were hanging, right near the door to the outside, while the store is being destroyed. And then somebody comes up to him with a gun, and he quickly goes back into what they call the living quarters, locks the door behind him really fast. I mean, I'm picturing like, Liev Schreiber or something doing this. Like, can you imagine the adrenaline? He runs back upstairs and he has the coats. So when they ultimately escape the next morning or that following morning to Holland, all they have is their pajamas, their coats, and my grandfather has 20 Deutschmark in his coat pocket. That's all they have. They had a
Oh,
ride in a limousine. So a helpful neighbor got them a friendly limo driver who drove them to a place on the border that my grandfather had identified. They got out there. I won't get into all the details. It's
yeah.
very dramatic, but they
Yeah.
eventually ran across the border when the gendarme, like the local policeman on duty at the border crossing, left for 15 minutes before the replacement came at lunchtime. And they ran across the
Mm.
border at that point.
Wow. I mean, it's just like a movie, and the idea that your grandfather had the awareness that something in him moved him to do the things he did. And so many survivors and so many Jewish families have stories that can identify with this. Like my 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 grandmother-in-law, her mom came over from Russia, and she came over as a teenager. But this was when things just started to get bad, and they could only send over her to live with her uncle in New York City, because things were getting crazy, and she didn't even speak English.
Mm.
And so it was actually my grandmother-in-law's mother who didn't speak English. So it's like two generations from who I met.
Right.
But the stories, it's just like, wow, it's just like these people are so courageous and leaving everything that they knew. And the stories are just, and
And they're all so important. Each and every
Mhm.
story is so important.
So
And
important.
hopefully we'll be able to keep all of our family stories alive through the generations so we have them.
And then that was one of the things that I just was touched by, how your son Josh has been so supportive of going over to Germany with you, and taking that trip that your father was like, I'd never go to Germany. And even the UPS guys, their outfits were just something your grandfather and the state highway patrolman, I think it was, that he's like, oh, these are evil men, because they dressed in those brown uniforms like the German soldiers. And like, it was something your dad couldn't even, like, any association was just like, ah. And then
Right.
you faced it. Like, you went and you brought your family to help process these things, and visit that store, even though it was just demolished from the war. But gosh, so I mean, I read your book in like spurts. And so just to give the listeners a little like cliff note with the whole idea that they went into hiding, and then they ended up in the Netherlands, right? Your father Walter and his grandmother and his mother.
Yes.
And so they had the money to pay the farmer to get put in a hiding. Would you want to talk a little bit about that and your visit there to the farmhouse? Because it's
Yes.
just so magical.
When I think about the most amazing moments of my life, like probably 10 of the top 20 are on this trip. It was one thing after another. So I knew that my father was in hiding on the Lansink farm. Their name is Lansink, the Lansink farmer family. And I had the name of the town, very small farm town that it was in. And I thought, oh, I'll never find this family. But I did. That's a whole other story. I did. I was reunited with this family, and my father had been in touch with them until he died. So until 1994, he was in touch with them. And I had their information, but I couldn't communicate with them because they didn't speak English and I didn't speak Dutch. But somebody reconnected us, and I like to say reunited our families. And so I got to meet the man whose father and grandfather had hidden my family. And he knew my father, right? So because my father went there in 1991. So I got to meet Jan Lansink, and he took me back to the home that he no longer lived in, but another family lived there. And they were expecting us. This other family were all waiting in their living room for us to arrive. And I was with my son Josh, my husband, my brother, and my sister-in-law.
Okay.
And they said to us, would you like to see the attic now? And I had no idea this was even a remote possibility, never mind just being on this farm. So we went up into the attic and saw the exact space, the space where they were hidden. We stood, where they were for 2.5 years up in this attic, which had since been, the home had been renovated, right? But it was still this same space. It was just absolutely remarkable. So that's where my father, his mother, and grandmother had arrived on October 3rd, 1942, not knowing the family whose home they were coming to. The family, the farmer family, not really, I think, not knowing really what was, how serious this was. And together they made a hiding space, and they created a false closet, a false door, like all these levels of protection until you finally get to their hiding space. Thank goodness, because there were a number of times where they were almost found out, which
So
would
many
have been certain
people.
death for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. It was serious. Because, I mean, you wrote about how the Nazis would just show up. They
Mhm.
just do random showing, like pop-ins. And oh my gosh, that one where the one soldier was sympathetic, and he stood in front of the other one and
Yeah.
said that the farmer's wife was indecent. And you guys they were, your father's mom and grandmother were able to get into the hiding spot in time. It was just like, oh my God.
Yeah. And that was a great example of a member. That tall policeman was a member of the Dutch resistance. And so
Oh.
he was doing, whatever he was doing. I don't even know details and I don't know his name. I would love to find out his name. But yeah, so he was going to the farms and the places where he knew people were hiding to protect them in this same kind of way, because the second policeman that was there with him would not have been so nice.
So the Dutch resistance, that was a
The Dutch
thing.
resistance was amazing, especially in this part of the country where they were more in the farmland,
Mm.
as opposed to like in the Amsterdam area. That's usually what we hear about, the Anne Frank story. So
Mhm.
actually something like 38% of Jews in hiding in this part of the country survived, as opposed to less than 20% in Amsterdam.
Mm.
So
It
twice as
sort
many.
of makes sense because there's more space, there's
There's,
more
yeah,
opportunities.
there's more food in a way because they have farm, some of the farms had more food than in the city where you totally rely on the food coupons.
The chain, yeah, it's amazing how many really difficult situations center around food and lack of food and money and abundance, and and people are put into a scarcity mindset, that the horrific things that can happen. Um, it's just it's just really important, if you have enough to share, that you do,
Right,
because
right.
you don't know someone's tipping point. Um, and that's part
Yeah.
of compassion, right? Like, wow. And then, would you like to talk a little bit about how the synagogue was spared in that story? I just want to pepper in little magical stories that
Yeah,
struck me
yeah.
as just like such such wisdom, these people to do what they did. So if you want to share that one.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, and I'm going to preface that with, my father told a bunch of stories on his hour and 20-minute video.
Mhm.
And every story he told, if I was going to include it in the book, I had to vet it, right? So I researched every story. So
Mhm.
this story is probably not quite accurate. And I do state that in the book. But it's my father's memory
Mhm.
that that's also really interesting. I think he he was so moved by whatever happened that he wanted to remember it a certain way, and that's what comes across too. So it's like these memories and versus facts are all intertwined in a way. So what my father says is that the synagogue in the town that they were living in Holland before they went into hiding, and then after they came out of hiding, which is a beautiful, beautiful synagogue, that it had been spared because it was, a historic building, and that the Allied forces were told, and Germany was told, you can't destroy this building because it's a significant building. That's a beautiful story. And what I've been told is that's ridiculous in a way, because, first of all, the aim wasn't so good back then. And a lot of times the Allied forces mistakenly hit, the wrong place, just the
Mhm.
totally wrong place. So it could have easily been hit by mistake anyway. So, but it was used instead as like a prison. So there was a particular place in what is now the cafeteria that was a prison with very small cells that you could barely stand up in, and the Nazis would hold prisoners there for a while.
Mhm.
So, you know, thankfully that building was spared. I've been there on every trip I go. I go in that building. I attended services there one Saturday morning. It was just a beautiful
That's when
experience.
Josh read from the Torah, or he
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 was
did the
called up to
blessing.
the
He
Torah. Yeah, yeah.
so
That
special.
was, my father was with me so many through the whole story, but
Mhm.
that was one of the moments that I most felt his presence in that room, because I also know that that space to my father, which is where he went to Hebrew school for a couple of years to learn to become a bar mitzvah himself, I knew that this was a really special place to him based on his video. So there's
Mhm.
just so many levels to it. And yeah, that was a very meaningful moment.
And the the whole Josh represents the new generation that can
Yeah.
help us complete processing all this as much as we can, and the whole idea that he's youth, he's the future, and it's testimony to the survival of goodness and humanity. Like, it's
Hmm. The continuity.
a continuity. It's so
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah.
Mm.
And it's also interesting that as a third generation survivor, his perspective is different than mine.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't realize that in the beginning. And it was great having these really meaningful conversations with him about how he experienced the same thing that I experienced in a very different way.
Mm-hmm.
So I learned a lot about, the next generation and how they don't have as much of this inherited trauma. Thank goodness. Thank goodness. So that made me feel really much better.
Mm-hmm. And you've been so brave facing it. I mean, it's just amazing. So I know your book deserved that award, and I think there'll be many more.
Thank you. Thank you.
So cool. Oh, and then I just do you feel like you'd like to share anything about how going through this whole experience, visiting several times, going back for the Day of Remembrance, and how has this changed? I know you've changed so much since 2017 when you opened up this Pandora's box. Um, but if you were to share with the listeners or your readers any you know things about how your worldview has changed or your perspective, and just like you're a different person, but have you reflected on exactly what that means to you, and how you show up every day?
Hmm. It it has changed me so much. Is all I can say. I don't really have the words for it, but
Yeah.
I never thought about German people as being individual people before. My father taught me to
Mm-hmm.
think of German people, even the German people you know, of the today when he was alive, as the enemy. And it took me a lot of, this was the courage part. It took a lot of courage for me to even reach out to, for example, the descendant of the man who Aryanized my family's store, and that
Yes.
means that the Jewish people were all forced to sell or give away their stores, sell them at a very reduced rate. And so the man who currently owns that store that's been rebuilt after the war is the descendant of the man who Aryanized the store from my family.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to have a conversation with him. I'm not mad at him. I don't hold any grudges against him. And I sought him out, and I was able to sit down in another of the most amazing moments in my life and have a 1 hour conversation with him that was life changing. Because what I came to realize in a visceral way is that he's a person just like me. He wants the same things I want. He wants, peace in the world. He's a good person. He is um, upset about what happened during the war. I mean, the war was bad for everybody,
Mm-hmm.
really for everybody. And I never understood that really before. So he helped me see that. So just
Mm-hmm.
one of my big takeaways is just sit down for coffee, literally for coffee or tea with somebody who you think is different than you, and it's so important today more than
Mm.
ever, because we're going to find that we have so much more in common than not. And if we work from that place of what we have in common and that we want, a good earth for our children, I don't think anybody's going to argue that. Maybe that's a good place we can start at
Mm-hmm.
to start mending all these terrible rifts and worse that have been created in the world, especially recently. Yeah.
Yeah, this whole idea of separation, it's an illusion. We're all one mass consciousness. Like we're all one together. And yeah, it you actually, I stopped watching the news because it's like they were always trying to say this is bad and this is good, and it was I felt like I was getting set up in these dichotomies.
Mhm.
And like you said, if you really sit down with somebody and talk to them, you can really find common ground, but that doesn't sell viewership. They say, so I think so much of our knowledge what used to be based on what was presented to us, and now we have the chance to get firsthand knowledge and go there. Like I just think that the myth of separation and the illusion of that we're less than one is something that could really help humanity if we could wrap our heads around the idea that you're never alone and everyone's connected.
And we don't need to polarize ourselves.
Yes.
It's not black and white. The world is not black and white. And like you say on the news, that's the illusion that they are trying to create, and a lot of people are trying to create. But it's not like that.
It's not. So yes, a million, thousand, trillion times. Yes. And I would like to think that, that we could rebuild and regain trust and hope. And there's been so many things that we can overcome, but love will be the balm that soothes it. I'm not talking romantic love. I'm talking about compassion. I'm talking about acceptance and just being true to how you feel. And so then you can let someone else be true, and you can figure out, like you said, the common ground. Oh, it's just so lovely, Irene. I really appreciate that perspective.
And I talk about that. I do talks all over about my father's story. I actually like to say that I do talks with my father because I use the actual audio from his videos.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, so he and I tell his story. And I use the tagline, it's Shattered Stars, the power of courage, compassion, and kindness. And I talk at the beginning and end about how we all can use those attributes to make this world a better place. And, my father's story is just an example of how 18 individuals did that. They demonstrated courage, compassion, and kindness to help my family survive. We can do the same in this world, whatever that's going to look like. It's so important.
It's so important. And, it's like what I loved about the whole story was, okay, it's an awful situation, but they asked for help. They planned, people showed up, and, it's like this give and go of, people, humanity supporting each other. And it's just such an inspirational story. And I'm just so happy. And I think you should release any guilt that it's sat in the box in whatever, you had your father's, the pictures and the little coins that he made with the symbol of Zionism on them. It's just beautiful. That it was the right time when you did it, because you had time to dive into it. You had the resources. Like it was divine timing and guided. So, I don't think you wasted any time. You needed to go through what you needed to go through to get and give everything you gave to this. It's just really, your energy in it is so wonderful. And I'm sure it took years off your life, not years off your life, but added years to your life, that you were able to process this, and you didn't have this cloud above you that you didn't even understand what it was. Like you said, you had this feeling, there was this, you felt like you had to produce, you had to show yourself, because there was something, you knew there was something under the rug. You knew there was something that needed to be fixed, but intuitive, you just took action. And so it's just such an inspiring story. Your dad and you can't discount all the hours and resources you've dedicated to this.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And I had to do it. To me, it wasn't a choice. Not that I had to write the book, but that I had to go on these trips. Then I had to write the book because the most amazing things kept happening to me that I couldn't have imagined. They just kept showering down on me.
These synchronicities.
And it was almost like a sign.
Yeah.
Like I just had to write it. I didn't have a choice. I didn't want to write it. It had to be written. So here it is.
Yeah. And to me, like the cherry trees showing up, those were so powerful. The images of the cherry trees. I was just like, it you in life you get these affirmations, you get these
Mhm.
synchronicities, and that's part of the magic of life is being aware and acknowledging them and the people that showed up even at the school and the in the graveyard you went to it's just I encourage everyone, to read this story because it's just a beautiful testament. So, was
Thank
there
you.
anything else you wanted to share? Do you have a website where you talk about where you're going to speak next, or how do people
Yeah.
follow what you're up to?
Yeah, so my website is www.shatteredstars, all one word, .org, O-R-G.
Great.
And on it lists all the upcoming events. I don't have a time on all the events because I'm not being as specific as all that, but anybody can feel free to reach out to me on the contact page for more information.
Excellent. Well, thank you for being on Life of Love. It's been such a joy.
Thank you so much for having me, Julie.